There's no way I can do the whole video with these in, so give me a second. That's gross. Today is a special day, because today, dear viewers, we are discussing one of the greatest contributions to horror and Gothic literature, one of the most iconic stories of all time, one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented characters in literary history, Dracula. Is this too distracting? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Neverland Book Club. This is not the first video I've made on this topic, but I clearly just can't shut up about it. With the 2024 release of Nosferatu, I took a deep dive into the differences between the two classic monsters, and how culture begets their own form of horror, be it romantic or repugnant. Today I went to see Dracula, A Love Tale, in theaters. And it made me want to take an even deeper dive into the novel itself. This is not a film review. The film, though beautiful and entertaining, and scored by the Danny Elfman, by the way, it wasn't in any way a strict adaptation of the book. If anything, it felt like a nod to Coppola's 1992 Dracula with its costume, set design, and narrative story. However, this was a romance. Through and through. Bram Stoker's original novel was not. Which made me beg the question, why is Dracula constantly portrayed as a romance in pop culture, when in reality, the story is far darker? Let's get into it. We all know Dracula is the classic vampire book, but that wasn't the case back when it was published in 1897. Bram Stoker was not the first to author such a monster. Books like Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu in 1872 and The Vampire by John Polidori, published in 1819, are clearly present in the bones of the narrative, particularly through the letters and journal entries that weave the epistolary novel that is Dracula. It's no secret that audience expectations can veer an author's intentions off course, depending on their popularity and overall agenda. However, we see this on a wider scale with Dracula, across culture and over time. This was written in the late Victorian era, a period in history obsessed with purity culture, scientific progress, and imperial power. Again, if you want a more in-depth discussion about the influence of Dracula on modern media, go watch that video. But I will restate here, the influence of Dracula can be seen in its response to cultural and socioeconomic anxieties at the time of each adaptation, in addition to folklore. At its core, the story of Dracula represents the fear of the other, be it foreign, ancient, invasive. The threat is violence on the outside, yes, but also presence. Themes of Eastern superstitions and practices fought with Western modern thinking and treatment are heavily present throughout the novel. This, I found, represented more cultural or national unease and misunderstanding rather than one individual sense of evil or sole evil entity. So this is the part of the video where I'd normally give you a quick summary rundown. However, I'm not sure that's really necessary for this video. I mean, it's Dracula. Have you been living under a rock? Spoilers, duh. What I will discuss here, though, are the novel's themes: sexuality, repression, punishment, gendered sacrifice, religion, romance? Surprisingly, no. Not romance. Unlike almost every single adaptation of the text, there is absolutely no romance between the female protagonist, Mina, and the monster of Dracula. And I say protagonist in quotes here since the novel is more of an ensemble of characters and anecdotes rather than protagonist versus antagonist. Bringing it back to the time in which this was written, vampirism represented forbidden desire. One could argue for the desire of immortality at a time with rampant plague, yes, but also desire of the flesh. Puritan culture was at its peak, and witnessing two opposing representations of femininity and sacrifice, such as we see through Mina and Lucy, was culturally allegorical to the punishments expected of the time. Lucy's transgressions are framed as dangerous when left unchecked, leading to her demise, while Mina's acceptable feminine strength is rewarded in the end, going so far as Professor Van Helsing saying at one point in the novel how he's impressed with her mind, that it is just so much like a man's. But oh, her heart still as weak as a woman's. Like, okay. Not just allowing her to survive the story, but acknowledging her sacrifice and strength, not just as a woman, but at the end of the novel as a mother, as we see in Harker's final letter. This made me wonder why. In this day and age, we refuse to give Mina the ending the novel gave her. Instead, she dies a horrible death in Nosferatu. Spoiler. Or is abandoned in a castle or on the edge of a cliff. And those are supposed to be the romantic interpretations of the story? Don't get me wrong. I love a good dark romance where the girl falls for the bad boy, but in its 1897 glory, how could one spin elements of hypnosis, coercion, and bodily violation as romance. I mean, I'm into some kinky shit too, but this is taking it a bit too far, Dracky. Or no, it would be Stoker's fault. No, it's not. He didn't make it a romance. Whose fault is it? This is why Dracula felt more disturbing rather than sympathetic, where the horror of him becomes far more intimate. The story is told through different mediums of documentation. It's both cold and clinical while still deeply personal. Introspection ranging throughout depending on whose accounts we're reading, with entries from Dr. John Seward and learning of his practices contrasted with that of Professor Van Helsing. We see how modern tools fail to protect Lucy and Mina, representing the resistance of accepting progress, and the uncomfortable idea that such progress is not always guaranteed to protect us. Now, despite these elements of horror, Dracula is far more than just a horror novel. It's a gothic novel. Gothic horror novel. Hot goth girl novel. What's the difference, you ask? I've been waiting my whole life to tell you. The key element that makes the novel gothic is not just undiluted horror by itself, but dread. And under that umbrella of dread, we have themes of decay and corruption, an obsession with death and the human body, an emphasis of mood over plot, an isolated setting such as a castle or crypt or asylum, flowy white dresses, dark-haired women with rosy cheeks and big doll eyes, a man that's not really a man, but is a man, and it's kind of hot, maybe, and older, definitely older, decades older, or in the case of Frankenstein, literally born yesterday. And though this is not a prerequisite for Gothic horror, there's also the use of fragmented storytelling. The choice of using letters, journals, and recordings to tell the story gives the reader a sense of displacement and unease. There's a constant sense of missed information, not knowing the entire picture despite us as the reader having a view of each account laid out on the table for us with some red string and a corkboard handy. We know more than the characters. We see more through their shared perspectives. And through this, Stoker creates a tapestry, when viewed from a distance, gives off that dark, underlying sense of foreboding. The monster isn't just Dracula himself, but the sorrow Stoker plants within his readers without rush or jump scares, which I believe is something the film adaptations tend to get wrong, but not always in a bad way. Now, I'm not here to preach how the novel is better than the films. The novel is different than the films, each film with its own interpretations and liberties from the original story. As far back as the 1922 silent film Nosferatu, the films aren't wrong. They're translations of cultural desire, with early adaptations focusing on exoticism, menace, and theatrical horror, while later adaptations emphasized a more dark, romantic take on the story. A tale of doomed lovers which softened the cruel nature of Dracula, reframing his monstrosity as a tortured, misunderstood, immortal soul. These different takes, depending on the era and culture, reflected what the people wanted Dracula to be, not what the book insists upon. If Stoker intended for the story to be a romance between Mina and the monster, as it so often is depicted in modern adaptations, there would perhaps be a more mutual desire between the two, with far more consent and emotional intimacy. Stoker's Dracula does not love. He consumes. And where romance requires decision, the concept of vampirism removes that choice. The entire idea of Dracula being a fallen Christian soldier who renounces the name of God in response to the death of his beloved Elisabetta, and is cursed to walk the earth for centuries until finding her reincarnated soul in the form of Mina Murray. That is all a fabrication of the adaptations. Bram Stoker intended Dracula to be horrific. He lacks love. He lacks a soul. He does not mourn or regret or seek reunion. He exists as the embodiment of evil. And perhaps the most terrifying thing about him is his stagnation. Unlike other Gothic monsters such as Frankenstein's monster or Phantom of the Opera, Dracula does not grow. His character does not go through a metamorphosis of good faith. He is a symbol of death, of pestilence, of the immortality and inevitability of decay. With this, Dracula becomes less of a character and more of a symbol. This can be different depending on the generation or culture he enters. Predator, lover, anti-hero, tragic immortal, the novel is the foundation of the character, not the limit. This does not betray the sanctity of the book, at least not in my opinion. It only further proves its power. So, Dracula is not a love tale, but it is a story about desire, fear, and romanticizing that which may have the power to consume us. I love this story. I love stories like it. And I love the stories from which this were sired. If you've been taken by the many adaptations of Dracula and the folklore of vampirism, please read the original novel. Forgive its dated attitudes towards gendered themes and perhaps read from a perspective of intentional understanding and reflection. Notice the pacing, the structure. Take in the atmosphere and elements of psychological horror that seeps through every journal entry. Notice the thematic relevance to modern literature and how words such as these have the power to transcend time and circumstance. If you call yourself a gothic girly or just a lover of gothic literature or horror as a genre in general, please read this. Or if you'd like to take a bite into the curiosities of the occult and go even further, read Carmilla first. Some other titles to add to your TBR might be The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, Frankenstein, of course, by Mary Shelley, Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, The Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, and I recently reread Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, all of which will be linked below. Those links give the channel a little kickback, so thank you if you do use them. And if you do want a bit of romance to add to your TBR, may I humbly suggest this? I hear it's pretty good. No vampires, but there's some biting involved. Sometimes. All right, that's all I have for you today, dear viewers. Thank you so much for spending a bit of your mortal time with me. Today's shout out goes to CharlotteBoy6783. So I didn't expect my last video to get the kind of attention that it did. And although I encourage everyone to voice their opinions in the comments on the video topic, it's nice to sometimes read someone's story, somehow conveyed in less than a few hundred characters. Never stop considering new points of view, my dear Charlotte, and never stop searching for your next 5-star read. Perhaps it's closer than you think. That one wasn't bad, right? Am I getting better at this whole marketing thing? I'll keep trying. As you should stay lost and keep reading. Goodbye. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yes. Are you my familiar?